About 6 years ago, I started producing under the name Corporate, and then about 2 years ago, I changed that name from Corporate to Pedestrian Tactics. One of the first tracks I released as Corporate was called Ice. Thanks to Dirty Duck Audio, which is now Create TV, the track ended up in some unexpected places. Bass Nectar, Porter Robinson, Xylent, Zomboy have all played that track out in their live sets. Interestingly, Carl's Jr. licensed a modified version of the track to use for their beer battered fish sandwich ad. So I thought I'd walk through Ice and show you how I made it. It seems to have opened. This is pretty amazing because I made this back in Ableton 8. One of the first things that I could go over is a couple of the basses. So this first one, so it sounds like this large bass tone hits and then it sort of echoes off into the distance, right? So that's this guy. Nearly every instrument I've built is just done using Ableton's operator because it's one of the cleanest wave generator situations. And then I've piled effects on top of everything. A lot of these tracks have way too many effects on them. I'm just gonna call out the most important and crucial ones. So let me just turn off a bunch of these. Yeah, that's more like it. What you've got is like 4 saw waves that are all offsetting from each other. If I layer a few saw waves and I change the frequency of each one just by a little bit, they'll start to create this sort of layered effect. Then what happens is I put it through a chorus just to split the stereo. Amp it. And then the magic is happening in the vocoder plugin, which I abused through all of my corporate years. And yeah, I'm not actually using it as a vocoder. I'm switching the carrier on the vocoder to modulator. And that essentially makes it so that the vocoder is using itself instead of using a different source. Oh my God, doesn't that sound different? Things tend to sound a little gooey and almost analog when they go through the vocoder, so I naturally used it for everything forever. I switched the range so that the high end is all the way at the top and the low end is all the way at the bottom. And then kind of played with the depth until it started sounding gooey. There's a limiter to keep it from doing awful things, and then some equalization. The sort of trail off echo thing that's happening is just an illusion created by this EQ8, which I've modulated. It has a low end for the first portion, and then it's just the low end's cut out. So then it goes to mono once the sort of high pass comes in. So let's go into the main bass that happens during the drop. Okay, so there's 2 components to this. One is a boring solid note with a couple harmonics. The other bit is these. These were fun to make. They're all based off of square and saw waves. I did a lot of automation. You can see it happening on the filter here. Then there's some automation going on with a phaser that's later in the chain, and some automation happening with the reverb. Here's the mistake I made. I automated all of these in the modulation window for the MIDI track, as opposed to in the automation window on the timeline. When you're looking at a track with automations, you can actually line them all up so that you can control all of them at the same time, rather than having to toggle between each one. Ugh, why did I do this? So let's remove some effects. There's a compressor, we'll turn off this equalizer, phaser. Oh, this is hilarious. So you've got a single square wave with a filter, and I'm just automating the resonance and the frequency of that filter. It's got a chorus effect on top of it. The magic happens with the saturator. I just overly saturated it. And it starts sounding like everything by Disprove. Sorry, Disprove. The EQ8 is just not making it loud the whole time. Then I've got a phaser. You can see I'm doing a little automation with the rate. The other thing that was really important for this is an automated reverb. So look at the dry wet here. I'm just automating it so that at certain parts it's really reverby and other parts it isn't. That way you can create a full sound that you can constrict at any point so the track still sounds tight. There was a lot of texture that needed to happen that I didn't know how to do with instruments. So instead I would record my voice in little parts to add texture. There's an example where I do this like Wichita. Wichita. I called it Wichita. Okay. Oh yeah, and then the sound. The two things that I actually named in this track, Wichita and Tick. I recorded into a mic, I went take one chunk of that, then just pitch it up. Don't be afraid to use your mouth. Okay. Sampling previous tracks is super useful. That sort of tape sound that happens. Again, actually it's right here. That sound. This is from an old track I made called Deaf Night. It was a wall of sound and I could reverse it and I could do some weird tape effects with it. Again, using something that you've already mixed down adds a ton of texture versus trying to recreate something from scratch. The difficulty I had with this track is that I had the idea for this track so clear in my head that I ended up obsessing over a lot of small details rather than remaining flexible to finding new solutions. Okay, let's look at this yeah sample. That was me, but I couldn't hit that note. What I ended up doing was recording me saying yeah a little bit higher, except I made my voice a little bit like yeah, so that when I would pitch it down, it wouldn't sound unnatural. Let's unpitch this. Yeah. Yeah, that's the original. And then I just repeated it with the bass behind it. Yeah. The kick is a mixed down kick that I made in a different file. The snare is a group of a couple sounds, but then there's also a snap added. I find that adding a snap or some sort of treble component to the very beginning of a snare and then trailing out with lower frequencies helps with giving the snare a sort of punch. Okay, the last thing I want to look at on this track is the mastering. I felt kind of awful when some people have said they loved the mastering of Ice because at the time I didn't actually have a proper limiter. Basically what's happening on this mastering chain is the track is clipping and I'm just trying to hide the fact that it's clipping as much as possible. There's one Ableton limiter that's barely doing any work. And yeah, at a couple points I like ducked the bass so that there wouldn't be clipping. If I turn off all my mastering effects. Yeah. Okay, so the track is too loud without the mastering effects. So we'll do a utility. I guess the point that I can make about mixing with this is if you can get the track to sound as good as possible without any mastering effects and then finally come in at the end, the mastering really should just be there to make the track louder, maybe. In practice, if I were to do this over again now, what I would typically do is not touch the mastering channel while I'm working on the song. And then when I'm ready to master, I put a single utility on the mastering channel and then turn the gain so that the output is just below max. At that point, I'll pull up some other song for reference and then add some sort of equalizer and change my levels. And then I'll add some sort of limiter. The one I like right now is FabFilter Pro L because it's fairly simple. So that's Ice. If you got any questions, leave them in the comments. I'm curious.